welcome to continuing study of C10, clause by clause. So I just want to say that welcome to everyone involved. I know we're missing one member at this point, but we'll soon shortly. Now, the way this normally works is when the bells start ringing, I'm under the understanding there will be 30-minute bells. We normally break at that point, but in the past, what I've done is when we face that, I've extended into to kind of finish the thought that we were thinking about, as it were. And but to do that, I would need unanimous consent. Now, before we came online, Mr. Reyes and I had the discussion about should we continue or end or suspend when the bells start ringing. Mr. Reyes, do you want to start?
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, for letting me give you some information or give you my opinion in any case. I think that when the bells ring, we should clue up our discussions. We have a number of MPs who are on House duty today. On our side, I'm thinking in particular of Mr. Shields, of Mr. Scott Aitchison, and also on the Bloc Québécois, there is Mr. Champoux. Those people need to physically go to the House of Commons. And I know that we were following earlier and we needed to wait for the voting result in order to start. So time is also required for those people to leave the House of Commons and to arrive at the committee. And so especially with the current circumstances, I think it is important for all MPs to be able to be present at the committee, especially those who are committee members, to hear about the issues and participate in the discussions, because we have a few issues before us.
Okay, Mr. Reyes, thank you very much. Yes, normally, like I said, in order for me to continue into the debate, I would need unanimous consent. So it appears we don't have it. Sorry, not presupposing anything, but from what I just gathered. So, and not saying they weren't valid points, Mr. Reyes, they were valid points. Ms. McPherson, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I just wanted to move the motion that I had shared with the committee. I don't know if this is the time that I should be doing that.
Yeah, normally I would say yes, but here's the situation that we have, and I have discussed this because I have read your motion. We received it, of course, and I'm assuming everybody has received it. The way this works is we are currently on PV 21.1, which is the Green Party's amendment. Now, according to standing orders, recent standing orders, the way it works for independent parties, I should say parties not recognized in the House, don't take that the wrong way, Mr. Manley, but they are automatically deemed moved. So when we get to anything that resembles PV, Party Ver Amendment, then we have to go with that because it's already been deemed moved. If this was Lib or this was Conservative Party, yes, I could tell you to go ahead because those are not automatically moved as such. Because just a bit of background, for independent parties who wish to appear or not recognized parties on the committee, what happens is they can submit amendments, they can debate them, but they cannot vote on them or move sub-amendments. Okay, so unfortunately, because of the rules, that's deemed moved. We have to deal with 21.1, but I can assure you, as chair, once 21.1, and now that you've given me notice, once 21.1 is dispensed, we can go to your motion, and I'll recognize you first. Okay. I see, Mr. Waugh.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. No, thanks for the clarification. We were just wondering the same. It's kind of different circumstances, especially today with votes. And I think you've cleared it up pretty well. And we do know that there's, Mr. Champoux from the Bloc, for example, could not be with us here today because of House duty. And we also have two members, and I see one.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président.
Point of order, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Sorry, point order.
Oui.
Oh, here we go.
Simplement mentionner mon...
I just wanted to mention that I'm Sébastien Lemire. I'm from the Bloc, and I am replacing Mr. Champoux.
Ben oui, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
That was a sufficient sound check, even though I'm going to have to rule it wasn't the point of order, but a point of order accepted because I think we may have gotten a sound check from you to do that. So we've managed to do that, I hope. Mr. Waugh, you have the floor.
No, I was just going to say there's a rare sighting there. 2 members in committee. Isn't that nice to see? So, no, Mr. Chair, you've made some good points here today. The NDP motion should be discussed with the recent developments of today. It might be a short discussion, but we'll see. So that's all I have to say.
Sorry, can I get everyone who doesn't want to speak to put down their hands? I think I'm going to Mr. Shields.
Yeah, and just clarification. I think what you were talking about in the sense when the bells are ring, that you just don't cut people off in mid-sentence. People get to finish up the thoughts. I assume that's what you were referring to in the sense of how we would finish up before we went to vote.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Shields, for the clarification. Normally in the past, if the bells start ringing, I look to a conclusion of the thought that we are doing, but in order to do that, I need unanimous consent. And if the bells start ringing, I will allow you to finish your sentence to a certain degree. But seeing that I won't have unanimous consent, I'm going to have to cut it when I feel it's necessary. Ms. McPherson.
It's possible I forgot to lower my hand. Sorry.
Oh, we call those legacy hands now, apparently. Okay, seeing no further conversation, and we are now in committee. Meeting number, help me, Amy. Meeting number?
39.
39. I was going to say 40, but I knew that was wrong. Meeting number 39. Clause by clause consideration of Bill C-10. Welcome, everyone. As was pointed out earlier, we are virtual except for 2 members who are sitting in our committee room. That might be a positive sign of things ahead. Nevertheless, we start with PV 21.1, as I mentioned, has been deemed moved. It's from the Green Party. Mr. Manley, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment brings back 4.1. It states that this act does not apply in respect of programs that are uploaded to an online undertaking that provides a social media service by a user of the service who is not the provider of the service or the provider's affiliate or agent or mandatory of either of them for transmission or retransmission over the internet and reception by other users of the service, except where the Canadian creator of the program has voluntarily chosen to be subject to the act for discoverability purposes. And the online undertaking whose broadcasting consists only of such programs except where the Canadian creator of a program has voluntarily chosen to be subject to the act for discoverability purposes. So the idea behind this exemption is a compromise. This would exempt user-generated content from regulation under the act unless a Canadian creator of programs opts to voluntarily have their programs available for discoverability. And this would address concerns about freedom of speech, which are also providing an option for Canadians in the cultural industry to be promoted through discoverability. The process of ensuring that you're discoverable is fairly straightforward under the CRTC regulations. There's a point system, where you determine whether the producer or the director, the actors are Canadian, and it's a 6 out of 10 score. So, it depends on a number of factors, where it's produced, who's involved with the production, and that determines for film and television. And then with the MAPLE system, it's fairly straightforward. MAPLE stands for music, artist, performance, and lyrics. And you need to fulfill at least 2 of those criteria to be able to be eligible for Canadian content. So I feel like this is a compromise, respects the freedom of speech. It doesn't deal with the issues around algorithmic bias, which is another serious issue we need to be discussing, because we have seen in recent cases with the Red Dress Day on May 5th that family members and people posting about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, posting about family members who had gone missing, had their posts removed by Instagram and Facebook through an algorithm. And these social media platforms are, have their processes where they're determining what content will be pulled down and which content won't be pulled down. And there's been complaints by people in the Black Lives Matter movement, by Indigenous Lives Matter movement, people who are standing up for the rights of Palestinians or people in Crimea or other locations, people who are standing up for old growth forests, have had their posts removed. They've been blocked on these social media platforms, which are in fact, we talk about free speech, but this is not really a democratic space. It is a corporate space. And so it is something that we need to deal with. But I hope that members of the committee will support this amendment, because I think it's a fair compromise that those Canadian content producers who do want to be subject to the Act and have discoverability of their Canadian productions should be able to have that option. Thank you.
Mr. Shields.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, point of order just before.
Oh, point of order, sir. Go ahead.
I'm so unfamiliar with sitting in a committee room. How do I make sure my hand is raised? I don't want to hold it up the entire time. I want to make sure I'm in the queue. On Zoom, I would just leave my hand up, but here, it might fall off.
That's that's a valid point, sir. I'm going to have to work out a system here to do that. I'm going to converse with Amy. It's been a while since we've had anybody in the room, so let me try to work something out here. I'm assuming you have your hand up. Is that correct?
Is it possible that they could be on Zoom at the same time, so that they can know? Okay.
Yeah, it's possible. I'm going to have to try to work that out, because I have a hybrid here that I have to work on. So nevertheless, Mr. Shields, the only problem is I don't know in what order Mr. Aitchison falls into, but with your permission, I have Mr. Shields, Mr. Reyes, Mr. Waugh. Mr. Aitchison, would you be highly offended if I put you after Mr. Waugh?
I think it's only most appropriate that I go after those three distinguished parliamentarians.
Well, with that endorsement, I'll do just that. Mr. Shields, properly endorsed. There you go, sir. The floor is yours.
Oh, that's scary. Thank you. I assume the staff from the department is with us today.
Yes, they are.
So my first question would be to the staff in the sense of how would they view this dual approach in the sense of voluntary and those who don't, in the sense from the Department of Heritage. Do they have an opinion because they've seen this amendment for a while? I'd be interested in knowing what they would think of this dual approach.
Okay, I see Mr. Ripley. Before I go to Mr. Ripley, let's try to do this as we worked out before. If you're asking questions to the department and you wish to follow up, can you just raise your hand towards the camera so I can see that you want to follow up with it? I don't want to go by or give someone else the floor when I shouldn't be. Mr. Ripley, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question, Mr. Shields. A couple of things that I would just point out. The first one is with respect to the reintroduction of language along the lines of Section 4.1. The challenge for the committee is that language is in a certain degree of tension with amendments that the committee has now passed. And so one of the challenges is, as the committee may now recall, it has passed some language in 9.1 that speaks specifically about programs that are uploaded to an online undertaking that provides a social media service. So implicitly, there is acknowledgement that the jurisdiction of the CRTC extends to that programming. With the reintroduction of 4.1, you can see that there's a certain amount of tension now with that language that the committee has previously endorsed. The legal situation of how that would play out is extremely unclear. A court or the CRTC would presumably try to reconcile those two things and find a way for both of those provisions to stand. And so that could be done by reading down certain provisions of the Act or trying to find a way to make sense of those two things. So I think the the committee should be aware that it may be creating a situation of a degree of legal uncertainty. And then with respect to the question about like how it would work in practice if a social media creator wanted to opt out of that, again, it's unclear how that would be operationalized by the CRTC at this juncture. Again, on the one hand, the committee has endorsed language that gives the CRTC certain powers to promote the discoverability of those creators. And then on the other hand, if this language was passed, there is a suggestion that they could potentially opt out of that. So again, the legal situation of how those two things would work together is quite unclear.
Un rappel au règlement, Monsieur le Président.
Point of order, Mr. Chair, please.
Point of order. Is that Mr. Shampoo, I hear?
C'est bien moi, Monsieur.
It is indeed me. I'm here in the committee room. I would like to thank Mr. Lemire for placing me for a few moments. I just wanted to bring to your attention, Mr. Chair, when there is a vote in the House of Commons, MPs must be there in the House. And as you know, that suspends committee works until those MPs are able to get to the committee room or to join virtually. Mr. Chair, during the vote, I was in the House just a little earlier, and the committee was very quick to start the committee, even though the voting results had not been given, and I had to hurry here, even though in the House we were debating very important things. I won't spend 30 minutes on it, Mr. Chair, but I found that concerning. And I even thought, in the worst case, it was a lack of respect. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Shampoo, I can honestly say to you, you consider me to be duly scolded. I think you have a valid point. I did not realize, in my mind, I was thinking you were online and or on Zoom and not in the House. That was rather disrespectful of me to proceed without you coming. I can assure you, sir, with all my apologies, it will not happen again. The only thing I ask is if you could update us that you're in the House, you're on your way. That would help us out dramatically. But yes, again, my apologies to anybody as we try to get used to having people in the room and not in the room again. We're going to do this right. So again, Mr. Shampoo, you have my deepest apologies, and I'm going to give the floor back again.
Thank you.
Well, we finished with Mr. Shields. I think you wanted another question, Mr. Shields. Go ahead.
Right. Thank you. And again, I appreciate Mr. Manley in a sense of bringing what he believes in a sense of compromise to deal with some of the issues that we're dealing with. So I'm thanking him for doing that. And just following up again with our department, I heard two things. One, that the legislation, in a sense of amendments that have been passed, I believe he's saying that the CRTC would view the challenge of they are all inclusive of all of these social media platforms and the creators, that they would view that legislation as inclusive. And so if we adopt this piece, this amendment, it would create sort of a challenge for them to understand how they wouldn't be dealing with those who are not included. So I think that's the first part, I think, of what the department was telling me. I think the second part was that the opting in or opting out was something that the department had a challenge trying to comprehend how the Heritage Department through the CRTC would deal with that. And I think that he expressed something in the sense that if there's discoverability, it would be the discoverability of those who opted in and maybe not those who opted out. And he had a concern, I believe, that he was suggesting that could arise. Of course, that leads me to the same conclusion. If the CRTC is looking at those for discoverability more than they are of others that are Canadian, that creates the same type of process. So I think the department would be stating somewhat of the concern that many of us have had, that in doing what Mr. Manley has said, that volunteering in or not, that those who volunteered in with discoverability automatically would be rated higher because of that discoverability. So I think that's problematic by why this resolution, in the sense of 4.1, is why we were extremely, extremely concerned that it now will do the same thing, that those Canadians, creators and culture, those people who are participating in it, that there is going to be a mechanism within the CRTC that ranks and rates discoverability of some more than others. So I think this amendment points out exactly the challenge, and I think the department is basically, staff is saying that the concern they would have of those who are opting in versus those who are opting out. And the whole process of a mechanism of opting in, it's one of the challenges that we have in the sense of creating programs. It's sort of like the $5,000 for the house renovation when 30,000 people applied to begin with. The website fell apart. So it's an interesting thought. And again, Mr. Manley, I really appreciate you looking at as a solution. You have a long history of working in the industry and know it well. So I really appreciate you looking at another avenue which might resolve that freedom of speech and leave those who choose not to be involved in one. I think that's significant in what you're attempting to do here. But I think the challenge is, from what I'm listening to the department, it may create that same thing that we believe has been created by removing that piece now. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Mr. Reyes.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just lower my hand so it's not ambiguous. And first of all, I would like to thank Mr. Manley. Thank him for those explanations he gave about his amendment. First of all, he very clearly showed that he had concern for the issue of freedom of expression for certain creators, certain citizens who publish things online. So I think that his objective is very healthy in that he is trying, as we are trying, to fill the gaps in this Bill C-10. However, I have a few questions for our experts, or perhaps Mr. Manley would also like to answer them. I have more than one question, and I'll let you know that right out of the gate, Mr. Chair. So, at the end of Section A, it says, unless they voluntarily chose to be subjected to the Act for discoverability purposes, I have a question about that. Because in the notes that the officials gave to the minister, it goes beyond our definition that we have of conventional broadcasters. Because what we're trying to do is to ensure that digital broadcasters respect the same act that would be equitable compared to traditional broadcasters. But we've heard from many experts, many Canadians, even former members of the CRTC, that all Canadians upload content on the various social media. They all use social media or other apps, whether it be workout apps or video game apps online. And in certain notes, we're talking about even giving CRTC power to regulate audiobooks and other similar products. So this goes beyond our definition that we have in mind. Here we're talking about all Canadians who upload information on all various platforms online. So my question is how? How would the government or the CRTC ensure that all Canadians, 38 million of them, be aware that they could have that option to voluntarily be subject to the Act for discoverability purposes? That is my first question, and I would like to put that to the experts. So would it be the CRTC's responsibility? Would it be the government's? Am I mistaken in believing that that responsibility would be in place to make sure that all Canadians were aware of this possibility? Mr. Manley can also give his opinion. Perhaps Mr. Ripley first, but Mr. Chair, it's up to you to give the floor.
Okay, I'll go with Mr. Ripley first, and will I go to Mr. Manley afterwards? Would you like that? Okay, so let's go with Mr. Ripley first.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Reyes, for the question. Here's the answer. It would be the CRTC's responsibility to monitor the situation and to put a regime in place, and it would be the CRTC's responsibility to implement the Canadian broadcasting system. And yes, absolutely. There would certainly be operational challenges when it comes to how that would work. Because on the one hand, the CRTC is proposing to give the CRTC powers to create orders regarding creator discoverability. And Mr. Manley's proposal is to create an opt-in possibility for that regime. So there does seem to be tension between those two proposals or those two amendments. And it would be up to the CRTC to find a way to create a mechanism so that Canadians can opt in to the regime. And again, that would certainly pose an operational challenge.
Okay, I'm going to go to Mr. Manley. Now, Mr. Manley, you don't have to if you're...
Sure, I don't mind.
Okay, go ahead.
So I'm a producer, and I've produced lots of different documentaries and films. And in the process of doing that, afterwards, I've sold documentaries to CBC or to provincial broadcasters who are regulated under the CRTC and the Act. And when I submit those programs, they ask me to fill out the form as to whether it meets Canadian content criteria or not. If it doesn't meet Canadian content criteria, then it doesn't count towards what they're broadcasting as Canadian content. But it gives me the option of doing that, and I fill out the forms. It's a fairly easy process to do. I submit them to the CRTC. I get my certification, and away I go. So that's the idea behind this, is just to have an opt-in. I guess if it conflicts with something that's already been passed, then that might create some issues in terms of the CRTC figuring out how that would work. But that's the idea, is to have an opt-in system so that people who do want to have discoverability could have that option, and then you would have something for those online undertakings to ensure that people that do want to be recognized as Canadian content on their platforms, whether that pops up a little Canadian flag on the side, or when they're suggesting if you like this, you might like that, that they show Canadian content in that process. And maybe it's an opt-in for users of that platform. Currently, when I watch stuff on social media, I have no idea where it's produced. I can search in YouTube under search words to find out if perhaps it was made in Canada. But a lot of producers don't bother putting tags in to say where their productions were made. So I'm just thinking about a system that could work for users of the platform to find Canadian content, and for producers of Canadian content to be more easily found by people who want to support Canadian talent.
Okay. Monsieur Reyes?
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I hear what Mr. Manley is saying. But when I read Section A of this amendment, I see Canadian creators of a program. He's a producer. He's made a number of productions. I'm sure he's had staff helping him. But at the same time, all Canadians who post content on social media, well, at our committee, we have a whole debate at this time, and even at the House of Commons, we're hearing this demagogy where it's said that either you're on the one side with GAFA, the GAFAs of this world, or you're on the other side with Canadian and Quebec artists. But what we are defending is the freedom of all Canadians who use social media, who use the various applications, audiobooks, who have podcasts. I have artists at home in my riding who earn their living from their art, and they don't ask for any grants whatsoever. And we're even hearing from journalists asking, what does the government or the CRTC want to do to regulate social media? And they are worried that other countries will follow suit and that they will lose this access they have to this platform to access the whole world and share their art. So these people are on YouTube, Spotify, they're on all of these music platforms, and they're earning a living from it. They are artists, just as people who belong to the Union des Artistes are artists. But those people are absolutely not represented in any way. And I'll tell you why I have concerns when I see this sort of thing. Since the beginning, we have acted in good faith. We have been asking questions about this bill. And this was a bill that had an objective at the beginning, and that objective was talked about by the minister in all of his interviews. And the objective was to regulate these online broadcasters, rather, and everything changed when 4.1 was removed. And the minister said that there have been hundreds of witness testimonies, but all of the witnesses were invited after the initial bill. That's when we did our committee study. But then 4.1 was removed after, and 9.1, which was our solution to rectify the situation, was not carried. So we are working on a bill here now that is 30 years old, that will be in place for another 30 years, and that is supposed to give power to the CRTC. And yet, it seems we have no idea of the can of worms that we're opening through this bill. So I am concerned. I'm not concerned when I see what Mr. Manley is proposing, because I believe that he wants to solve the problem. So I take my hat off to him, sincerely. But I think we need more. I don't think it will suffice, because I don't see how the government or the CRTC is going to succeed in informing every last Canadian, everyone who uploads content, that they have this opt-out or opt-in for discoverability possibility. So I have major concerns, and some of them are linked to our original arguments. And we know that the government is trying to rush us to get through all of these amendments. And many of these amendments were made by the government itself, and many were tabled by each party. And we even know that the Green Party is trying to help us, because this bill is full of gaps. I might have another question for Mr. Ripley now. can you tell me, in your opinion as a public servant, when it comes to that Section A, for Canadians, creators of a program to have voluntarily chosen for discoverability purposes, is it true that that would be all Canadians who upload anything on social media, or would it only be Canadians with recognized recorded shows recognized by the CRTC? Could you answer that question?
Ripley?
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So perhaps just to contextualize things again, we still have Section 2.1, which stipulates that Canadians will not be treated as broadcasters if they are not affiliated with an online undertaking or social media. So the discoverability obligation is on online undertakings and social media. The operational challenge is the following. It is the CRTC's responsibility to implement a regulatory framework that will apply to a number of online undertakings. For example, YouTube is one, that's for sure. That's the case that we often, the example we often use, but there are others. So the operational challenge is that something will have to be put in place, managed by the CRTC. But the obligation to put that in place, well, online undertakings will want to know that, okay, this Canadian creator wanted to be part of the discoverability system, and this other Canadian creator opted out. So as you can see, this raises a number of operational questions as to how would an online undertaking manage that on a social media platform. So again, our concerns have to do with the operational challenges. How would this work from day to day? So that does raise questions. Is it okay for me to continue, Mr. Chair? Thank you. So you highlighted that 2.1 made it so that users were not included, if I understood correctly. But one of our questions is not necessarily just about users. It's about the content uploaded on social media. So I put that question to the Minister of Justice, when he came, and he refused to answer the question whether or not that was that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms applied to users only, or also their content. Was their content protected by the Charter? He refused to answer that question, and that's the crux of the problem for us, as well as for a number of other experts who are taking the floor publicly and on social media recently. They're concerned. And some of them have not had the opportunity to testify before the committee. So what do you have to say about the content?
Mr. Ripley.
Oui, la question est pour Monsieur Ripley.
Yes, the question is for Mr. Ripley.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Reyes. So, the goal of 4.1 was to exclude programming managed or uploaded by users. As the committee knows, 4.1 was replaced by the limitations in 9.1, and we still have not gotten to the questions related to Section 10. And the discoverability power, again, applies to the user. So the content belongs to social media, does not belong to an individual, and the regulatory power would subject a social media And then the social media would have the power to promote creators. It is not a question of promoting their content. And once again, that is precisely to deal with that question of deciding what is Canadian content. So that is the focus of this power. So it really would be the Canadian artists and creators. So Mr. Reyes, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but Mr. Manley raised a number of points that would involve content. And once again, the amendment that the committee carried is not a question of promoting Canadian content on social media. It is a question of promoting Canadian creators. Okay. But if I can continue along with what you're saying, can you confirm my analysis here that what is announced or what is stipulated here would have an impact on G13, which was tabled by the Liberals, and BQ 33 also? What impacts would that have for social media? So could power... A point of order, please, Mr. Chair.
Yes, point of order, Monsieur Champoux.
Monsieur Champoux, Monsieur.
Yes, Mr. Chair. I almost called you Mr. Champoux. My colleague, Mr. Reyes, is raising amendments that have not been studied by the committee yet, that might even end up being sub-amended. So I'm wondering how we could get a reliable answer from the experts if they have not even been debated yet.
Yeah, Mr. Reyes, yeah, I understand some of it pertains to future amendments. Yes, I understand. But if you want to make that as part of your overall argument, I'm fine with that. The only thing is, if you start going into future amendments, that doesn't really give the person to move them a chance to debate them from the beginning. So I would ask that you try to refrain from talking about any possible future amendments. But if you want to include some of it, perhaps in your current argument, I understand, but I'm going to have to watch it. Just police yourself accordingly. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll try and be disciplined here. And here's my question, and please let me know if I'm mistaken. I didn't want to talk about G13 or BQ33. I agree with my colleague, Mr. Champoux, that we'll deal with those all in due course. But I know that the officials have prepared to answer our questions, and I think that Mr. Manley's amendment will have repercussions on G13 and BQ33. And that's why I was just asking the experts. I didn't want to go any further than that. I don't want to be out of order. If it's not out of order, I would like an answer to that question.
Yes, that is fine. You can do that. I understand. Sometimes these amendments can refer to one that's ahead and back and so on and so forth. And I know this caused a lot of confusion sometimes, but what you just said is valid, and take that as a ruling, but proceed as you were.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So I'll come back to my question. Mr. Ripley, for Mr. Manley's amendment, will the amendment have repercussions on G13 and BQ33? Because we see that there are components that have to do with different users and their use of these systems. Could that have to do with further restrictions? So can you tell me if it will have an impact on G13 and BQ33 in the future? And I don't mean to get into a debate on those two amendments at all. We'll do that in due course.
Merci pour la question.
Thank you, Mr. Reyes, for the question. Mr. Chair, may I reply?
Sorry, yes, I thought you were having such a great conversation. I didn't want to intervene, but Mr. Ripley, you have the floor.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. President. Oui, le projet.
Yes, Bill C-10 does stipulate a regulatory power to set up a recording system, or a registry system, rather, in order to help the CRTC enforce the system. For example, for the CRTC to know that such and such an online undertaking is operating in Canada, and here is the contact person for that undertaking, etc. So that is why the bill sets out that power. Now, 4.1 was removed, and social media were included. And because of that, it is true that this registration power could apply to social media, but as I was saying to Mr. Reyes, this does not target users. So the powers in 9.1, the powers in 10, the powers in 11.1, their objective is really to target online undertakings or conventional broadcasters. So it is not a matter of putting in place a registration requirement that would apply to users. Once again, 2.1 very clearly indicates that users are not considered broadcasters, and therefore they are not subject to the CRTC jurisdiction. Instead, that obligation would apply to social media platforms or other online undertakings to register with the CRTC. Perfect. And this would be my last question, Mr. Chair. After that, I will give the floor to someone else. So, Mr. Ripley, with all due respect, my question was not quite that. And we've been debating on social media and their users and content, etc. But my question, in order to make a good decision, was, is Mr. Manley's amendment something that could have repercussions on BQ33 and G13, the government amendment? Because those two are coming up afterwards. And that is really all that I wanted the answer to. Because when I look at analyses, I see some contradictory information, and I'm wondering what the repercussions could be on the rest of this. And I agree with my colleagues that I should not get into a debate on G13 or BQ33. I just want to confirm, would this cause any friction, given that the similar elements are raised?
Pas de façon directe, monsieur.
Well, not directly, Mr. Reyes. I'm not sure if the assumption is that a registration system would be created for Canadian creators. I was trying to clarify earlier, this is not a matter of using that power in Section 10 to put that kind of system in place. So no, it would not have a direct impact, no.
Merci.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, everyone. Just if I could just put a little bit of clarification beyond that, what I talked about earlier. I see, for the most part, we realize that future amendments proposed by parties are generally confidential. Yes. However, in some cases, one will affect the other, and it gives the current debate a proper context. So what I'm asking members to be cognizant of is this. I have no problems if you want to refer to an amendment in the future that is one of your own. But I'm reticent, and I think Mr. Champoux stressed his concern, and rightly so, about how you would draw in other people's amendments into this debate without them having to debate it or move it first. So that to me, that's very important. So I ask that you use discretion. Now, my final point before I go any further. It is now, it's come to my attention that we do have extra time afforded to us. I say that gingerly because I don't like telling people we're extending this debate without giving you advance notice. All right. So we're well within 24 hours. I like to do that, as you know, because I like to be respectful. However, since we started around just slightly under 20 minutes late, we have we can extend this up to 3:30 Eastern time. I guess that's 1:30 Alberta time. Um, we can extend up to that point. I don't need an answer right now. I just like for you to have a discussion amongst each other. If you can, text each other, let me know, because in order for me to extend, I need unanimous consent to do it. So that's adding an extra half an hour onto this meeting. Just think about it for now. And when the time comes at 3 Eastern, which is when we normally break, I will ask once again if you wish. That being said, Amy just tell, no, I don't really need UC to extend, but as you understand, I would like to have unanimous consent to understand. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, now let's go to Mr. Waugh. You're next.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to officials of the Department of Heritage. And I too want to thank Mr. Manley for his efforts in bringing forward amendments to the Broadcasting Act. As you've all talked about, it hasn't been updated for 10 years. And I think for the last several months, we forgot about the conventional broadcasters. We've dipped into the digital world. And when we first started this, it was all about the conventional broadcasters who are suffering badly in this country. Many radio and television stations are leaving the airwaves almost monthly. And Mr. Manley would know that because he was part of community radio for many years. He's a producer. It gets harder and harder to sell a product when there is black on TV channels. And that's probably, I look at BC and all the radio stations out there that have gone dark over the last year. And he's seen that too. And I want to thank Mr. Manley talking about the point system, because it's very complicated and you need the score of 6 out of 10. And when we talk about, Canadians, where is it being shot? Where is it being produced? Who's the actor or actresses involved? And then the maple system. Those are the discussions we can't forget about here in committee, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank Mr. Manley for bringing that out, because he's been involved in community radio for decades. And as a producer, he gives us some insight in that. To the department officials, this is an interesting proposition, because when Ian Scott, the current chair of the Canadian Radio Television Commission, he came to committee March 26th. And now what we're seeing, and the department officials have acknowledged today, this will be an operational challenge. Well, Mr. Scott hasn't had the ability since 4.1 was eliminated in April to talk about the CRTC. Mr. Scott, when he was in committee, and I asked him point blank, do you have the capabilities of enforcing C10? His first answer out of his mouth was, yes, but I got to go to Treasury Board. And we all know what that's going to be, asking for more money on behalf of the CRTC to operate this. And it is a concern. And Mr. Ripley, I'm just going to ask you, because, we, like I said, March 26th, we had the CRTC in front of us, and then we've seen all these changes and operational challenges. What you told us here today will be front and center with the CRTC. Could you elaborate on those operational challenges, not only money-wise, but the capacity of the CRTC? You have heard me and Mr. Manley talk about the capacity of the CRTC for years. They give the 7-year licenses and then walk away and then come back 6.5 years later to have a peak. So when I hear operational challenges tied into the CRTC, wow, a red flag. So I will leave it up to the department officials. I would like you to explain the operational challenges to the committee as we move forward with this amendment. And what are the operational challenges that you as a department see that the CRTC will have to be aware of going forward here? So anyone in the department.
Mr. Ripley.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Waugh, for the question and giving me the opportunity to clarify. So my comments to Monsieur Reyes were specifically with respect to the proposal on the table by Mr. Manley to introduce a mechanism whereby creators could opt in to a discoverability framework set up by the CRTC, with the implication that some creators would be outside of that. And the point I was making is that type of framework raises operational challenges for both the CRTC, that would have to think about how you actually put in place a mechanism where a creator could put up their hand and say, I want in, others could say, I'm not in. And then it raises operational challenges at the service level on a service like YouTube, who would have to navigate how you actually then put that into practice in real life. So that was the point I was trying to make. I think just stepping back a level, the proposal that the committee has previously looked at and adopted with respect to 9.1, there have to reiterate that the first step when it comes to thinking about how to move forward with a discoverability framework will be the CRTC doing a regulatory hearing on what makes sense. And again, there are, I think, a variety of different ways we could imagine that social media services could help raise the profile or visibility of Canadian creators. And part of the job of the CRTC will be balancing those interests of of creators of social media services who are going to say, well, we have very real practical limits in terms of what we're able to do, and here's how our service operates. And so, again, my comment was not so much, at a general level, but recognizing that the committee has previously adopted those powers and including that discoverability one and is suggesting that it be given to the CRTC. And what Mr. Manley has put on the table is something that has a degree of tension with that, and is what I was trying to highlight, because it gives the ability for some people to be part of it and other people not. And I think it's just very challenging to think about how that would be put into practice day to day, given the nature of social media. That was the point I was trying to make, Mr. Waugh.
I have one other question, if I can, Mr. Chair, to Mr. Ripley. So really what you're saying, this would still mean those creators approved then and licensed by the CRTC would still see their social media videos and posts really prioritized over those of other social media creators, and the issues would still be the same, I believe. The question of what kind of content gets, deprioritized is just as important, in my mind, as those that would be prioritized. So, and I can see a big issue here with cultural and art groups because many of them are well connected and lobby the CRTC. So they'll still be able to gain a major advantage, I think, of having the CRTC force really social media sites to promote their content over that of the universe of, independent YouTube creators, artists, and influencers who really don't have the same advantages. So it's really not a level playing field. Am I reading that right? Mr. Ripley?
Mr. Ripley, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Waugh. So, the impetus from the government's perspective in terms of providing the CRTC with this discoverability power with respect to, again, Canadian creators is recognizes that social media can be very powerful tools for helping individuals find and connect and discover new artists and creators. And so the impetus is simply recognizing that powerful role that they can play. And again, I'm going to be cautious on presupposing kind of, again, the outcome of those regulatory proceedings at the CRTC. But the goal at a simple level would be to say, okay, when you're on a social media service and you're researching, I don't know, pick your genre of music that may be of interest to you, whether it's country music or whatever, Mr. Waugh, because you're from the West.
Sheepdogs.
Sure. That, this is fundamentally asking those companies to think about ways that they could surface, Canadian artists, local artists, and creators, so that they're doing their part on raising their profile, so that when you use those services to say, okay, what's the country music scene around me, that you are being profile, you're giving the profile of Canadian artists or creators, that may be relevant to you.
And this has to be done 9 months after this bill passes for the
Mr. Ripley.
CRTC?
Mr. Ripley.
So what the minister had said, Mr. Waugh, is that his intention would be to bring forward the policy direction following a royal assent of the bill, and ask for the first wave or the first tranche of regulatory work to be completed in the 9 months, which is, that first tranche primarily includes putting in place a framework whereby the online undertakings, the online broadcasters, would be required to contribute. I think there is recognition that to expect that everything, all the repercussions of C10, that they would be completed in 9 months is ambitious, and so that's why that first phase would focus on having the online undertakings contribute, with a 2-year horizon for all of the work to be completed.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Waugh. Thank you for referencing one of my favorite bands, the Sheepdogs, Pride of Saskatoon. Let's now go to Mr. Aitchison, who's in the committee room. Mr. Aitchison.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank Mr. Ripley for those final few comments. I automatically thought cue the lobbyists, because there's 9 months to try to influence things the way you want them to be influenced. And I actually kind of want to focus specifically on that issue, and I guess it's in general. It relates, I think, to my problem overall with big government programs, is that the bigger the government, the more interference it has, the greater chance for there to be undue influence. And Mr. Waugh, I think, quite capably raised that issue. And I actually want to ask the question of Mr. Manley specifically, because he has obviously some experience with the system as it exists today in the traditional broadcasting realm. I have absolutely zero experience with it. But I'm curious to know from Mr. Manley, if I could start with this question, the process of trying to get recognized as Canadian content in the traditional system, were you aware of, examples where clearly some high-paid lobbyists were able to get their client's product broadcast somewhere before maybe a smaller operation like yours?
Mr. Manley?
That's exactly how the system works, actually. The number of productions that get produced in this country that for the traditional broadcasters by producers, it's about 95% of the same people that produce over and over and over again. And to break into that system is very difficult. It's actually a small number of commissioning editors that determine what gets commissioned in this country by CTV or Global or any of the provincial broadcasters or CBC. So it's a difficult thing to break into. I just want to correct Mr. Waugh. I've spent a very, very small amount of my time in community radio. I've actually, worked on hundreds of TV episodes in the broadcast industry, and I've produced and directed documentaries my own and commissioned docs. I've worked in artist management and done record deals, international deals, international licensing agreements for artists who have succeeded all across the planet, and done very well through the CanCon system that helped them finance tours into the United States, because they could afford to get in a van and drive across the states based on the money that they made in Canada by having radio play in Canada. So there is a system that is in place that is stacked towards companies that work very closely with the big broadcasters. And I have produced lots of films that have just gone onto YouTube or onto my own pay-per-view through Vimeo or other avenues. I have other things that are licensed here and there in other parts of the world. And when I have had a broadcaster pick something up, then I go through the CRTC process of certification. And it's a fairly straightforward process. In terms of the comments by Mr. Ripley about how could the social media channels work with this? Well, when you upload a video to YouTube, you can set a number of tags on there. So I can say, my name, where it was produced, what the key subject areas are. And I don't know if anybody here has done web design, but it's a pretty straightforward process to add another line in there that says, is this Canadian content? And do you have a CanCon, a CRTC certification number? And when you're doing searches online on YouTube, it would be, simply like, are you interested in Canadian content? Click here. So these kind of things can be done quite easily through web design. It's not rocket science anymore. I did, do some work in computer engineering as well. So way back in the day, and I don't see, it's not a black box. It's not a huge problem. So those are my comments. Well, thank you.
May I sorry, Mr. H, go ahead.
Yeah,
yes,
sorry.
Go ahead.
It was a much longer answer to my question than I expected. You must be in politics now.
I was watching.
Well done. You actually answered it right off the hop when you said that's exactly how the system works. And so, at the risk of precipitating, another longer answer, I wonder if that's the way the system works. Do you not recognize the risk of actually creating, or recreating the existing system on the internet? I thought one of the great advantages of these online tools was the remarkable democratizing effect they had, where anybody could be, producing what they want. And I keep coming back to the example of, Justin Bieber, who didn't have to worry about, some producer in some tower in Manhattan deciding that he was good enough. He became a superstar because of this tool that was available to everybody equally. And so I wonder, do you not fear with your amendment? And again, I appreciate what you're trying to do. You're Mr. Compromise, which is lovely. But do you not fear that this is going to just kind of perpetuate a really bad system on the internet? Sorry, that's to Mr. Manley as well.
Before I go to Mr. Manley, can you please refine your answer to the question only because if I allow you to go any further, you're also in the lineup, but you're going to be jumping over Mr. Shields' intervention if I allow you to go any further. Mr. Manley, you have the floor to answer the question, please.
No, I don't actually think that would be the same problem, because with CTV or Global, you need to deal with a commissioning editor. And so you have to sell the program to them, either to have it commissioned or to be acquired afterwards. With the internet, that's not the same process. So there's no commissioning editor. It's really just a button you click that says this is Canadian content, and I have filled out a form that says A, B, C, D, that the producer to the director are Canadian, it was shot in Canada, or the actors are Canadian, and it meets 6 out of 10 points to be able to be recognized as Canadian content. So no commissioning editor on YouTube. That's not what I'm saying. And I think that the process would still be wide open. All I'm saying is you would have something that would show for discoverability purposes that this is Canadian content and easy for Canadians to find to support Canadian talent.
But Mr. Manley, isn't that a fairly wild assumption to think that the CRTC would only have, discoverability requirements that just say that there has to have Canada in the tag, when clearly there's quite a process to adjudicate whether something is sufficiently Canadian to be promoted as Canadian? You can't just have a tag that says Canadian.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Point of order, Ms. DeBruzen.
I think we reached the point. I mean, right now we are not going into CRTC regulatory making pieces. Like this is going quite far afield from this amendment.
Ms. DeBruzen, Ms. DeBruzen.
It's not really far afield.
No, hold on. I don't want to spur an argument here between the two. You're right. So we've talked about this before. Let's try to stay germane to the amendment at hand in this particular case. Mr. Manley, I believe you have a question, or you received a question. Do you wish to answer?
I didn't really get to finish the question that I was asking him before I was unceremoniously interrupted there.
That's all right. Well, you're ceremoniously recognized once again.
Okay. I want to I just want to get to this point about how, Mr. Manley, you feel like we won't be recreating the same bad system because there's, not two individuals to sort of decide what gets on CTV or CBC. But the CRTC, through its discoverability rules, do you think it's conceivable that the only thing that they will require for discoverability rules is to have a tag that says it's Canadian? What about all the rules that determine what is sufficiently Canadian or not? You say right now you have to fill out these lengthy forms to describe, where it was produced, all that kind of stuff to determine how Canadian it was, whether it meets the Canadian content requirements. So I have to assume then that the CRTC, when it starts to apply these rules online, will have to have more than just a simple Canadian tag. It'll have to have an awful lot more detail, would it not?
Mr. Manley.
The CRTC process is very simple. It's a very simple form. This film is made by Paul Manley, a Canadian, directed by Paul Manley, a Canadian. The actors are Canadian or not Canadian. This was produced in Canada. Check, check, check. Here is your CRTC number. And now you are there for discoverability. The process of getting on CTV is about acquisition or commissioning. It is about money, and it is about selling a product to a corporation. With YouTube, that is not what you're doing. It is a platform that you can upload to freely. And this would be a process of just saying, this is a certified Canadian program with ABCD simplified form to do. It's really, really simple. Basic. Thanks.
Okay. I think
Mr. Aitchison?
I think I'm done. I think Mr. Manley has more faith in the bureaucracy than I do, but that's good for me. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Shields.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question for Mr. Ripley and Mr. Manley. And for Mr. Ripley, yeah, I might be for Alberta, but I'm looking for classical instrumental, not that other type of music you might have referred to of somebody coming from the West. So, Mr. Manley, in the sense of, I'm going to get down to a numbers figure, and maybe you can't answer it, but maybe you can generalize it. If this type of amendments we're talking about are approved, CRTC then is faced with, as you said, a conundrum before. Has there been any discussion if you're talking about implementing this, the CRTC in 9 months, in the sense of cost and number of employees it would take to do with it? Because they've got a conundrum to resolve if they implemented this amendment.
Mr. Ripley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I certainly meant no disrespect, Mr. Shields. For the record, I did my high school years out in Alberta, so I have lots of friends who like country music and lots of friends who don't like country music.
Yeah, it's a split. So the question to you, in the sense of this kind of amendment being adopted, you referred to the conundrum before, cost and number of people that might have to deal with this in 9 months. Mr. Ripley?
Mr. Ripley, go ahead.
Sorry, I apologize. I wasn't clear if the question was for me or for Mr. Manley. Thank you for the question, Mr. Shields. Indeed, there is a fair amount of regulatory work that needs to be completed over the course of 9 months. From the get-go, the government's always acknowledged that the legislative piece is the first piece, and the details do indeed get worked out through regulation. 9 months. Is again the minister's stated intent, recognizing we need to give them some time to do that, but also recognizing, as the committee has pointed out, there is a sector, and that's the Canadian broadcasting sector, that currently operates under a certain set of rules that foreign online undertakings are not subject to, and they are really keen to ensure that there's a fair regulatory framework across the board. The intention moving forward is that, like the current system, the CRTC's regulatory operational expenses would be recovered ultimately from the industry. So the CRTC imposes what are called Part 1 fees, and those get recovered. And so the idea moving forward is that, just like CTV and TVA and company have to pay in to the operation of the system moving forward, online undertakings such as Netflix or Spotify, etc., will need to contribute to the operation of the CRTC.
So just to follow up for that one, are you suggesting cost recovery?
Mr. Ripley?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Shields. The CRTC has the regulatory powers already to, and the way the system works on the broadcasting side is through a cost recovery model, whereby the CRTC recovers, it's approximately, I think, about $30 million per year from the Canadian industry that pays for the operation of the system, so to speak. And so the expectation is that model would continue moving forward. Others will contribute to it.
Thank you. Mr. Manley.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's your amendment, so you're getting lots of questions because of it, and maybe a little bit of your background. You referred to the 95% who may have received, in the sense of what you thought they had done, and left a small single-digit percentage for the others. How does that relate to the money and funding in the sense of support? Where does it follow in the sense of money? Does it follow to that 95% that support they may get, or to the 5 single-digit numbers? It refers to your amendment that I'm talking about as well.
Mr. Manley.
The money actually follows with the commissioning, and so if you are acquired, if I produce something and it's acquired, I'm not eligible for funding unless I get an acquisition, which is why I have other amendments coming up to deal with that specific issue. Because I think that system needs to be opened up in terms of the Canadian Media Fund, so that people who produce strictly for things like YouTube and don't want to deal with the traditional broadcasters can have access to funding based on producing Canadian content. The certification process, by the way, is an attestation system. So it is like when you do your taxes, you are attesting that you follow through, that everything you've said is truthful, and you could be audited later on. It's not like bureaucrats are sitting there checking every box that you've checked off. So, it's just it's not as complicated as everybody would like to try to make it out to be, the idea. If I could call a question, I would do it, but I don't think I have that ability. Thanks.
Well, with those people who tell me about the Canada Media Fund and filling out those forms, it's a different world than what you're talking about. But when you talked about it, it's your amendments. So, you can talk about your amendments. The chair just said going forward, if there's amendments you have, you could talk about them. Would you like to?
I have been. The funding process is actually different than the certification process. It absolutely is, because if you're going to get funding, if my amendments that are coming up come through, then people will have to hop through those hoops and actually show that what they are doing is Canadian content produced, directed by Canadians, and in Canada with Canadian actors, because that's what those funds should be allocated to.
So you believe then that would be more equalization?
Mr. Shields, sorry to interrupt for just 1 second. Let me provide a little bit of further clarification. You can't do indirectly what you can do directly, meaning that I understand you urging him on, but he cannot argue his future amendments. He can touch on it as far as subject matter is concerned, but I ask that he not argue his future amendments. Mr. Shields, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We tried. Appreciate that. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Mr. Manley.
I have nothing further to add. I think I've said enough. Thank you.
Okay.
I'd like to move along.
Every question put to you was support. Mr. Housefather. Mr. Housefather, we can't hear you, sir.
Can you hear me now, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. I think I was on the wrong speaker. So, Chairman, I just point out for committee members and Canadians what is exactly happening and what's been happening for the last hour and a half. We have an amendment on the floor that not one member of the committee is actually voting for. It's been clear from the comments that have been made. And yet, we've been debating it for more than an hour. And this is exactly the reason why this committee—
Point of order.
One moment, please. Ms. Harder.
Hi, thank you, Chair. The member who was just speaking presumes to know how I am going to—
Un rappel au règlement technique.
Point of order, technical point of order.
I'm sorry, that's not really a point of order. I apologize.
It's completely inappropriate
sorry for interrupting.
to do so.
Well,
I can't
the thing
hear
is,
the
I'm
member.
going to have to allow— I'm giving Mr. Housefather some latitude here because he's talking about other people's arguments. So what I'm going to do is, and the other thing is, well, let me go back to Mr. Housefather first. I don't have a sound check from you, Ms. Harder, but I'll get to it because you're up next. So Mr. Housefather, go ahead. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as I was pointing out, we are now incessantly prolonging debate on an amendment that is going to be defeated. And the simple goal is to stop the committee from actually doing its work. I think Canadians are starting to see that. I think it's exceptionally frustrating as a member of this committee to see a committee that used to work very well descend to this level that I think has gone far below the level any parliamentary committee should operate at. And I'm just voiced my disappointment, and that really explains why I think we need to go to time allocation at this point. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Ms. Harder. Ms. Harder, we don't have a voice check. Can you tell me the name of your riding, which I know we already know, but could you tell me in one sentence or less what's so wonderful about it?
It's pretty great. It's pretty great, Mr. Speaker. It'd be difficult to do in only one sentence. I represent the best riding in the nation. Sorry, I know that's unwelcome news to you. And don't get me wrong, I think your riding's really great too, but mine is just, a bit better. That's all.
No, well, I've always said as a member of parliament, if you don't think your riding is the best in the country, you should not be that member of parliament. Ms. Harder, you have the floor.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Chair, interestingly enough, the member who just spoke before me brought up a really good point, and that is, he feels that the members of this committee, in particular, I think he's referencing to the members who are on the Conservative side of the table, are frustrating the process. And I can understand that he feels probably maybe a little bit frustrated by that process. Nevertheless, there is something very important that is going on here. And in the same way that he felt it was necessary to clarify for the Canadian public who might be watching today, I feel that it's very important to further clarify. Right now, at committee, we are discussing Bill C-10 clause by clause, which means that we're going through it line by line and we're determining which parts of this bill are great and should move forward and which part of this bill are maybe questionable. And perhaps there are some that need to be amended. Maybe there's even some sub-amendments that are necessary in order to help strengthen this piece of legislation. In addition to that, there may be some parts of the bill that need to come out altogether.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. This sounds a whole lot more like debate than a point of order, and we have an amendment on the floor.
Well, this is not a point of order.
One second, everybody, please. I gave Mr. Housefather quite a bit of latitude here to talk about the process by which we're working through here. I'm affording Ms. Harder the same, although Ms. Harder might that can only go on for so long because, as Ms. DeBruzen pointed out, we are on PV 21.1. I know it's been regarded, some people refer to the debate that has happened in the House. I have absolutely no instruction from the House. Otherwise, what we are doing right now, which is in the middle of clause by clause on C10, and Mr. Brusen, yes, she does have the floor following Mr. Housefather. So Ms. Harder, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. And so what is being discussed here at this committee then is, to your point, we are discussing an amendment that was brought forward by Mr. Manley. And that amendment has to do with discoverability. Now, interestingly enough, there are a number of amendments that are before this committee that have been given notice of. And of course, it would be great if this could discuss each and every one of those amendments, including Mr. Manley's, which is the one we are currently on. However, the current government has chosen to move time allocation, which would then force this committee to ignore the discussion of those amendments that have been presented. And it would cause us to then have to force this piece of legislation through and back to the House. Now, Mr. Manley's motion deserves to be discussed in the same way that every single motion that is before this committee deserves to be discussed, because that is the right legislative process.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, go ahead, Ms. DeBruzen.
I feel like we're debating the debate that was in the House and not the amendment that's on the floor. If Ms. Harder feels like discussing this amendment, that would be lovely.
Yeah, I'm not going to make a ruling on that, other than the fact that there have been discussions outside committee. That is true. I would not want us to get into a full-fledged conversation, although both two parties within this committee have now discussed it. I please ask once again that we stick to the clause by clause that is before us, C10, and we are currently on PV 21.1 as an amendment moved by Mr. Manley. Ms. Harder, you have the floor again.
With regards to the motion, the amendment that is on the floor then that was presented by Mr. Manley, essentially what this is doing is it would make it so that some content is still more discoverable than others. It would be picking winners and losers. So you have content creators and they work hard. They work hard to display their talent on, let's say, a platform like YouTube and to garner an audience for themselves. And they work, organically in order to be able to do that. So they're incredibly successful in and of themselves. They're able to thrive as digital first artists or creators. Now, under this bill and further with this amendment, there would be this...
Rappel au règlement, Monsieur le Président.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Point of order, Mr. Champoux, s'il vous plaît.
Vous savez que j'ai horreur d'un...
Well, you know how much I hate interrupting Ms. Harder, but I believe that we were hearing from Mr. Housefather. And he was speaking to the amendment currently on the table, and I feel like Madam Harder is doing exactly the same thing. I'm not hearing a point of order here. I'm hearing a debate on the amendment on the table today. And Mr. Housefather had the floor. I'll let you judge the relevance of the current intervention, Mr. Chair.
I was under the impression that Mr. Housefather had concluded. What I can do, if Mr. Housefather also agrees with Hugh, I can put him back in the queue for debate. But in the meantime, Ms. Harder, you still have the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. So the amendment that is before us then, that Mr. Manley has brought to the committee for consideration, I mean, essentially what this is doing then is it's asking these different content generators, these creators, to determine on, I guess on their own is what he's saying, they would check a box to say, yes, I'm CanCon approved, or no, I'm not CanCon approved. And then they would, I guess, check another box saying, yes, I wish to have the government's dictatorial algorithm applied to me, or no, I don't wish to have the government's dictatorial algorithm applied to me, which then of course would determine whether or not, you know, they're going to be showing the favor of being discovered if they do meet, you know, the Canadian requirements. And then I guess if they don't meet the Canadian requirements, then it's claimed by Mr. Manley, and I believe by the, you know, other members at the table from the government side that that they're fine. If, you know, they'll, I don't know, they'll be left alone, I guess. But that doesn't work. Like, that doesn't work. Like, you can't have one artist in first place in terms of their discoverability, or in other words, how often they're seen by the general public or the viewers that would look for them. And they're in first place, and then someone else who makes, you know, meets the requirements, makes, you know, makes the grade, they're going to be bumped up to first place. Well, you can't have two at first place. It doesn't work. I don't know. Like, I played sports as a kid. I never knew that two teams could come out in first place. That just wasn't a thing. So perhaps Mr. Manley could expand on that and show me how that's possible. But to my knowledge, if something is going to be bumped up to first place, then that original thing that was at first place has to be bumped down to second place, and so on and so forth. So if you have certain artists or certain creators or certain content providers that are meeting this requirement to be quote unquote Canadian as determined by the government, and then you have other creators who are not meeting the criteria to be quote unquote Canadian, then you inevitably have some that are being bumped up and some that are being bumped down. I just, like, this motion or this amendment that we're debating does nothing to protect content creators, digital first artists. And so I guess my question through you, Chair, if you would be you know, willing to allow Mr. Manley to respond, is how can you have two content generators both exist at first place? Because if I'm understanding him correctly, he's stating that this amendment would not result in the downgrading of one creator in order to promote another, which I just fail to see how that's possible. I think in order to bump one person into first place, someone's got to drop down to second place, which means very quickly then this algorithm that the government is putting out there is going to determine who gets to be at the top and who has to fall to the bottom, which is a form of favoritism. And it's picking winners and losers. It's determining which artists get to succeed and which artists unfortunately have to fail, which artists can be discovered by Canadians and which artists, well, they just have to be pushed to the back room. Last I knew, artists weren't asking for this. You know, the government likes to say in the House of Commons that artists are wanting this bill, that they need the support of the government. They need to be dictated to. They need these algorithms that are going to bump them up or bump them down in terms of their discoverability. Well, I've talked to a lot of creators, a lot. And none of them have said that. In fact, they've all said quite the opposite. They've said, actually, we want the government to get out of the way. We're quite capable of thriving on our own. We've managed to be able to successfully put our talent out there for the world to enjoy and elicit an audience. And then, of course, as Canadians are watching them, and I should mention not only Canadians, but actually 90% of most creators in Canada, 90% of their audience is actually beyond our borders. That's amazing. It's amazing. Like they're just like they're enjoying phenomenal success. So kudos to them. Anyways, so they're not telling me that they need the government to intervene. They're not telling me that they want the government to pick winners and losers or choose favorites or determine whether or not their content is Canadian enough to be, you know, in the first frame on someone's computer screen, or if it has to drop down to frame 27. They're not telling me that. They're not. And so I feel it's important actually to state that, because the Heritage Minister in the House of Commons, you know, has advised me to speak with creators, and he has referenced, you know, a number of niche lobby groups that he himself has talked to. So I feel it's important to report back to the committee that I have gone and I have spoken to many of these creators who are doing phenomenal wonders for themselves, and I would say are generating content that Canadians are really enjoying and able to engage with. And of course, you know, these individuals are very successful on YouTube, and not just successful in terms of being able to provide content that Canadians enjoy and like, and again, not only Canadians, but a worldwide audience, but also they're being successful in being able to generate an income for themselves, because of course they're growing an audience organically. And because they have that audience, then of course there are companies that wish to advertise on their channels, which of course, you know, those companies pay in order to do that, which allows these artists or these creators to generate a bit of an income. It's phenomenal. It's absolutely amazing. I mean, we're talking about, you know, we're talking about more than 25,000 Canadians who are able to generate a full-time income of more than $100,000 a year because of their incredible success on YouTube. And they did it all on their own. Can you like imagine that? Like they did it all on their own without government support, without government getting their hands in there. I mean, we're talking about individuals who are not only remarkably talented in whatever their craft is that they're putting out there on YouTube for others to enjoy, but we're talking about creators who are also very savvy when it comes to entrepreneurship and being able to market themselves. And so all that to say, I wanted to make sure that the committee knew that I have had conversations with many of these individuals, as you know, as I was advised to do, and certainly they are reporting to me that they don't really want this legislation. Actually, they don't want the government to put algorithms in place that would meddle with their business and what they're doing online and the way that they function as creatives. So all that to say, coming back around, the amendment in front of us, Mr. Manley's amendment, would require that these creators, those who are putting content online, I guess they would, you know, my understanding, again, based on what he said, is that they would check a box. And that box would either be that, yes, they want to be considered within the algorithmic scheme, or nope, they don't want to be considered within the algorithmic scheme. And so if they decide yes, chances are they have already gone through the approval process for CanCon, which for the sake of time, I won't get into that today. Yeah, I'll leave it for now. But, so then maybe they have CanCon approval, and so they would check the box and say, yes, I want to be considered for, you know, just exactly how, quote, Canadian I am. And then, you know, that would, I guess, give permission for them to be bumped up or bumped down in terms of their discoverability. But then there would be this other box, or sorry, that same box could also just be left blank, which then I guess those content creators would not be considered by the algorithm, is what I understand Mr. Manley to be proposing. And he seems to be proposing that if you leave the box empty, if you don't choose to have it checked, then you're left unaffected, that you just get to exist without being bumped up or bumped down. But coming back around to my main point here, I just don't see how that's possible. Because if you're going to bump up those who check the box, then inevitably those who didn't check the box or who don't make the cut are going to get bumped down because you can't have two people in first place. It just doesn't work. I mean, imagine watching like the hockey playoffs if, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 teams all came in at quote first place. Like, it just doesn't work. Someone's got to be second, someone's got to be third, someone's got to be fourth. Like, that's just the nature of the game. So checking the box moves you up to first place, perhaps. Then if you're someone who didn't check the box, maybe you got demoted to page 27 of the platform. Well, we're still dealing with a significant problem here then in terms of censorship, in terms of accessibility, in terms of discoverability. So these artists deserve better. I mean, their voices deserve to be heard. We've heard from experts who have said, you know, Section 2B of the Charter, it makes sure that someone enjoys freedom of expression, freedom of belief, freedom of opinion. It's freedom of speech. And that freedom of speech, that freedom of expression goes, you know, it covers off two things. One, the freedom to be able to express your ideas or have them be known. And then two, the freedom to be able to access someone's ideas. And so there are two things going on there then. An artist does have the right and should have the freedom to put their ideas out there. And as a viewer, I also should have the right to be able to see those things, to be able to access those things, to be able to read those things or listen to that content. And so by preventing that, or by censoring that, I should say, then the government is actually infringing upon our charter rights as Canadians, because it's the government then that's determining, you know, to what extent something can be said or can't be said, and to the extent that something can be discovered or not discovered. And so it's this hindrance. It's this hindrance not only of the expression being put out there, but it's also this hindrance or this barrier to the expression being found and enjoyed. And so it's wrong. It's wrong. It's just so wrong to go in that direction. And so, you know, I guess my question still remains, and that is, I'm wondering if Mr. Manley can help me understand, you know, if creators, content generators, if they have to pick, you know, which box to check, you know, or if they want their content to fall under the guise of the algorithm or not, how does that work? How does that work for two creators to both come in at first place? How does it work that you could somehow remain unimpacted by this amendment or by the legislation as a whole if you leave the box blank in terms of being considered by the algorithm? Looking for some clarification there through you, Chair.
Okay, Mr. Manley, before you start, just again, can we just specifically to the question she has asked, all because I have Mr. Shields who is waiting. Mr. Manley, you have the floor.
Yeah, it's just simply a way of finding Canadian content. I don't know how you figure out when you're watching YouTube what is Canadian content or not, but I think this, you know, we've had this discussion for quite a while now, and this is simply a matter of continuing to talk about bumping up and bumping down, and two productions can't be first. How do you find Canadian content on YouTube? How do Canadians support Canadian content? I'll just leave it at that. You know, the filibuster is kind of just wearing thin, and I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay. Now, Ms. Harder, you asked a question. That doesn't mean you cede the floor. Are you finished?
I mean, Chair, I guess there's so much in that statement. I mean, one, I'm, you know, being accused of filibustering, which is, you know, often referred to in a derogatory way. I kind of take exception to that. Nevertheless, in addition to that, you know, my question hasn't exactly been answered. I was genuinely seeking some clarification. I don't know, maybe I'm missing something here, but I just don't understand how two things can both be coming in at first place.
Mr. Shields?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two things. One, because of what Mr. Housefather said, I can call it a point of order, but I don't really like to do that. But I will. Mr. Housefather, I've known for a while, and I find him very honorable, and I find him a very good politician and a parliamentarian, and I very much respect him. I ask questions, and I ask lots of questions at times. I'm looking for information, and to suggest what I am doing and have done for many years here on committees. I had a good debate with the parliamentary secretary last night in the House in the Late Show, and I appreciated that on this particular topic. That was a debate where we both stated some obvious positions, but to suggest that I am not looking for clarification, not looking for opportunities for discussion and getting feedback and learning more about what these things will do, I take exception to. And I know MP Housefather's an honorable gentleman MP, and I appreciate he's frustrated, but I take exception to his labeling what I do as a parliamentary as damaging and harming to the process of democracy, which at times can be messy, but it's democracy. So I object to his comments that he made. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would move for adjournment.
Okay, yes, well, I gave you that just so that you know, I gave you that latitude because Mr. Housefather brought it up. I let you answer it, that's fine. We're now, sorry, Mr. Housefather, did you have something? All right, let's go to, sorry, adjournment motion has been moved for adjournment of the meeting. Am I getting that correct, Mr. Shields? Is that what you meant?
Yes.
Okay, Madam Clerk.
Yes, sir. Motion to adjourn the meeting. Mr. Housefather?
Sure. Yes.
Madame Essette? Sorry, Mr. Vancouverden? Mr. Vancouverden?
Yes,
Mr.
I
Bruce?
second.
I'm sorry, yes, you agree to adjourn the meeting?
Yes, I do.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Rusin?
Yes.
Ms. Ian?
Yes.
Mr. Lewis?
Yes.
Monsieur Reyes?
Oui.
Mr. Aitchison?
Yes, please.
Mr. Shields?
Yes.
Mr. Waugh?
Yes.
Monsieur Champoux?
Oui.
Ms. McPherson?
Yes.
Sir, 11 yeas.
And you adjourn, we'll see everybody at the usual time on Monday.